Dawn hasn't broken, but Elend's hands are already shaking as she carries the empty bucket toward the pup's chamber. 4 years of this. 4 years of the same nightmare. Inside the cold stone room, Kael is already awake, sitting on the edge of his small bed. His thin nightshirt hangs off his fragile shoulders. Those strange black veins pulse faintly beneath his pale skin like dark rivers under ice. "Good morning, Elend," he whispers, his voice so small it breaks her heart. She can't speak. She never can on these mornings. She just takes his tiny hand, Gods, it's always so cold, and leads him down the corridor, through the courtyard, to the barrel. The water is already there. Chunks of ice float on the surface like jagged teeth. Torin had it drawn from the frozen lake before midnight, ensuring maximum suffering. On the balcony above, Alpha Torin stands motionless, his golden eyes fixed on his son. No warmth, no mercy, just cold observation. "Please," Elend whispers to the universe, to the moon goddess, to anyone listening. But no one ever answers. Kael steps into the barrel without being told. He's learned not to resist. As the ice water engulfs his small body, his breath hitches. But he doesn't cry out. He just looks up at his father's silhouette and whispers through chattering teeth, "I'm sorry I'm dirty, Father. I'm trying to be clean." What happens when a father's grief becomes a child's nightmare? When cruelty becomes ritual? When torture becomes transformation? Subscribe to find out, because this story will haunt you in the best way possible. Now let's begin. The screaming stopped at midnight, and Alpha Torin stood outside the birthing chamber with his fists clenched so tightly that his claws had drawn blood from his own palms. He didn't notice. For 16 hours, he had listened to his mate's agony, her voice growing weaker with each contraction until finally, silence. The kind of silence that devours hope. The door opened. The court physician, an ancient wolf named Maris, emerged with her hands stained red and her eyes hollow. She didn't need to speak. Torin already knew. "The Queen?" His voice cracked on the word. "Gone." Maris's voice was barely a whisper. "The bleeding. We couldn't stop it. I'm sorry, Alpha. She fought until the very end." Torin's world tilted. The stone walls of the corridor seemed to close in, the torches dimming as if the very light mourned with him. Elara, his mate, his heart, and the female who had gentled his roughest edges and made him believe he could be more than his father's son. Gone. "The child?" he managed, though part of him didn't want to know. Maris hesitated. That hesitation would haunt Torin for years to come. "Alive. A boy. But Alpha, you need to see him." Something in her tone made his blood run cold. He pushed past her into the birthing chamber, and the smell hit him first. Blood, yes, but underneath it something else. Something wrong, like winter had crept into the room and died there. Elara lay on the bed, so pale she looked carved from marble. Her golden hair, usually radiant, was matted and dark. Her eyes were closed. She could have been sleeping, if not for the terrible stillness of her chest. But Torin's gaze was dragged away from his dead mate to the small bundle in the midwife's trembling arms. The baby was quiet, too quiet. No crying, no movement. Just those eyes, already open, already aware in a way that newborns shouldn't be. And beneath the paper-thin skin of his tiny arms, his neck, his chest, black veins pulsed like rivers of ink. "What is that?" Torin breathed, stepping closer. "What's wrong with him?" "We don't know, Alpha," the midwife stammered, pulling the baby back instinctively. "He was born like this. The veins, they're not normal, and he's so cold. We've wrapped him in blankets, but his skin feels like ice," Maris finished, her voice grim. She moved to stand beside Torin, staring down at the child with an expression caught between pity and fear. "I've been a physician for 40 years, Alpha. I've delivered hundreds of pups. I've never seen anything like this." Torin reached out, his hand shaking, and touched his son's cheek. The midwife was right. The child's skin was unnaturally cold, as if winter itself flowed through his veins instead of blood. The baby turned his head at the touch, those too aware eyes locking onto his father's face. And in that moment, grief curdled into something darker. "He killed her." The words fell from Torin's mouth like stones into still water. This thing killed my mate." "Alpha, no," Maris began, but Torin wasn't listening. "Look at him. Those veins, that coldness. This isn't natural. This is wrong. This is rot." His voice rose, cracking with anguish and rage. "She was healthy. She was strong. And then she carried this, and it drained her. It poisoned her." "It's just a baby," Maris said firmly, placing a hand on his arm. "Whatever this is, whatever he carries, he's still your son. He's still Alara's son." But Torin pulled away, his eyes wild. In his mind, a terrible logic was forming, a logic built on grief and fear and the desperate need to make sense of a senseless loss. His mate was dead. This child with his wrong veins and ice-cold skin was alive. Therefore, the child had taken her life. The child carried something dark, something that had consumed Alara from the inside. "Bring water," Torin commanded suddenly. "The coldest water you can find, from the winter lake." The room went still. "Alpha?" Maris's voice was careful, dangerous. "What are you planning? If he carries rot, it must be cleansed." Torin's voice had gone flat, as emotionless, the voice of a man who had already made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "Cold water, pure water. It will wash away whatever darkness lives in him." "He's a newborn!" The midwife clutched the baby tighter. "The shock could kill him." "Then perhaps that would be a mercy." The words hung in the air like a curse. Maris opened her mouth to argue, to plead, to do something, but Torin's eyes had already gone cold and distant. The Alpha was gone. Only the grieving madman remained. It was then that Elin entered the room. She was new to the household, hired just 3 days prior as a junior maid. She'd been sent to bring fresh linens, and instead walked into a nightmare. She saw the dead queen on the bed. She saw the Alpha's wild eyes. She saw the physician's horror. And she saw the tiny baby with the black veins, as so small and helpless in the midwife's arms. "You," Torin pointed at her. "Fetch a basin. Fill it with water from the lake. Quickly." Elin's mouth went dry. "My lord, Now." She ran. What else could she do? She was an Omega, barely 19, with no family and no protection. She ran to the courtyard, to the well that drew from the underground springs fed by the frozen lake. The water that came up was so cold it burned her hands. She carried the heavy basin back to the birthing chamber, her arms screaming, her heart hammering. When she returned, Torin had taken the baby from the midwife. The child still hadn't cried. He just stared up at his father with those ancient eyes, while his black veins pulsed steadily beneath his skin. "Set it down," Torin ordered. Elin placed the basin on the floor, water sloshing over the sides. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to grab the baby and flee into the night, but fear rooted her in place. Torin knelt beside the basin. For just a moment his hands trembled as he held his son. For just a moment, Elin thought he might come to his senses. Then he plunged the newborn into the ice water. The baby's body went rigid. His tiny mouth opened in a silent gasp. The black veins flared bright, then dimmed, then flared again. Seconds passed. 5, 10, 15. Too long. Far too long. "Alpha, please!" Maris lunged forward, but Torin held up a hand, stopping her. "The rot must be cleansed," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the submerged infant. "It must be washed away." Finally, mercifully, he pulled the baby out. The child was blue-lipped and shaking, but alive. Still alive. Those eyes opened again, finding his father's face, and Elin could have sworn she saw something in them that was far too old to belong to something just born. "This will be done every day," Torin said quietly, wrapping the baby in a towel. "Every morning, before the sun rises. until the rot is gone, until he's clean. Elin looked at the dead queen on the bed. She looked at the mad Alpha holding his condemned son. She looked at Maris, who had tears streaming down her weathered face, and she knew, with terrible certainty, that she had just witnessed the first frost of a very long winter. Elin's hands no longer trembled when she opened Kael's door. 3 years, 1,095 mornings of the same ritual, and her body had learned to go numb before her mind could catch up. It was the only way to survive it. The hallway was dark, and the pre-dawn cold seeping through the stone walls like a living thing. Her footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence as she made her way to the small chamber at the end of the east wing, far from the Alpha's quarters, far from the Pack's common areas. Out of sight, out of mind. She pushed open the door without knocking. There was no point. Kael was always awake. The boy sat on the edge of his narrow bed, his bare feet not quite touching the floor. 3 years old, and already he had learned the posture of the condemned, back straight, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on nothing. His nightshirt hung loose on his thin frame, and those black veins traced patterns up his arms like dark lightning frozen beneath his skin. "Good morning, Elin," he whispered. The same words, every morning. It's the same small voice that broke her heart in exactly the same way, over and over again, until she thought there would be nothing left to break. "Good morning, little one," she replied, keeping her voice steady. She'd learned that too, how to sound calm when everything inside her was screaming. Kael slipped off the bed without being told, his movements practiced and resigned. He knew the routine as well as she did. He reached up and took her hand, his fingers ice cold even in the relative warmth of his chamber, and together they walked through the sleeping castle toward the courtyard. The corridors were empty. They always were at this hour. The Pack had learned not to witness what happened in the dawn light. It was easier to pretend ignorance when you didn't actually see the crime. Elin had seen Pack members turn down different hallways when they spotted her leading Kael in the early morning. She'd watched mothers pull their pups closer and hurry past. She'd heard the whispers that died the moment she entered a room. "Someone should stop this. It's not right. That poor child." But whispers changed nothing. Who challenges an Alpha? Who risks their position, their safety, their family's future for someone else's son? The Pack had made their choice long ago, and it was the choice of cowards. Elin had no room to judge. She was making the same choice every morning. They reached the courtyard just as the sky was beginning to lighten from black to deep gray. Winter still held the territory in its grip, and frost covered everything like a glittering shroud. In the center of the courtyard sat the barrel, old oak, reinforced with iron bands filled to the brim with water that had been drawn from the lake the night before. Chunks of ice floated on the surface. Elin's stomach clenched the way it always did. 3 years, and this moment never got easier. She glanced up at the Alpha's balcony. Torin was already there, a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. He stood motionless, arms crossed, watching, always watching. In 3 years, he had never missed a single morning. His vigil was as ritualized as the punishment itself. Kael followed her gaze upward. His expression didn't change. No fear, no hope, nothing. Just acceptance. That was what 3 years had done to him. It had carved away everything except compliance. "I'm ready," he said quietly. Elin knelt beside him, her knees protesting against the frozen stone, as she wanted to say something, anything, to make this moment less terrible. But what words existed for this? What comfort could she possibly offer? "Be brave," she whispered, because it was all she had. Kael nodded solemnly, then walked to the barrel and gripped the edge with both hands. He was tall enough now that he could pull himself up and over the side without help, though Elin steadied him anyway. He swung his legs over and paused for just a heartbeat, looking down at the dark water and floating ice. Then he lowered himself in. The gasp that escaped him was involuntary, his body's rebellion against what his mind had accepted. His skin went white, then faintly blue. The black veins stood out in stark relief, pulsing rapidly as if his blood was trying to escape the cold. Elin placed her hands on his narrow shoulders, not to push him under, never that, but to steady him, to let him know she was there. "I'm sorry I'm dirty, Father," Kael called up to the balcony, his voice high and shaking from the cold. "I'm trying to be clean." The same words, every morning. Torin never responded. He just watched, his face carved from stone. 3 minutes. That was the required time. Elin counted each second in her head, the way she always did, because someone needed to make sure this didn't go on forever. At the 2-minute mark, Kael's lips had gone completely blue. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps. His small hands gripped the sides of the barrel so tightly his knuckles were white. But he didn't cry. He'd stopped crying after the first year. At 3 minutes exactly, Elin helped him climb out. Water streamed off his body, freezing in his hair, turning his nightshirt into a heavy, clinging weight. She wrapped him immediately in the rough towel she'd brought, rubbing his arms and back, trying to force warmth back into his small body. "Good," Torin's voice carried down from the balcony. Just that one word. Then he turned and disappeared back into his chambers, his duty fulfilled. Elin gathered Kael into her arms and carried him back inside, even though at 3 years old he was getting heavy. He tucked his face against her shoulder, shivering violently, and she felt the ice in his hair melt against her neck. As she carried him down the corridor, she passed a group of pack members on their way to the training grounds. They saw her, saw the soaking wet child in her arms, and their conversations faltered. As Gamma Marcus actually made eye contact with her for a brief second, and she saw something like shame flicker across his face. Then he looked away and kept walking. They all kept walking. Back in Kael's chamber, Elin stripped off his wet nightshirt and dressed him in dry clothes, her movements gentle and practiced. She'd hidden a warming stone under his blankets earlier, and she guided him to it now, wrapping him in every blanket she could find. "There now," she murmured, smoothing his wet hair back from his forehead. "Rest a bit. I'll bring you breakfast soon." Kael curled into the warmth, still shivering, but his eyes were already closing. The ritual exhausted him completely. As Elin turned to leave, she paused and looked back at him. In the growing morning light, those black veins seemed different, brighter somehow. She'd been noticing it for weeks now, the way they seemed to glow faintly after the ice baths, like embers under ash. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as a trick of the light. But it was there. She shook her head and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall and finally let herself take a shaking breath for 1,096 tomorrow. 1,096 times she would break her own heart. 1,096 times she would be complicit in this cruelty. And like everyone else in this cursed pack, she would do nothing to stop it. The kitchen was always warmest just after midday, when the ovens had been burning for hours, and the head cook was too busy shouting orders to notice one small maid slipping extra portions onto her tray. And Elin moved through the controlled chaos with practiced ease, her eyes tracking the cook's position while her hands worked quickly. A sweet roll left over from the Alpha's breakfast, a small wedge of cheese that wouldn't be missed, 3 strips of dried meat from the stores. Not much, but more than the thin gruel Kael was officially allotted. The head cook turned toward her, and Elin smoothly covered the contraband with a cloth napkin, arranging a pot of tea on top. "That for the young master?" the cook asked, wiping her hands on her already stained apron. Elin nodded, keeping her expression neutral. The pack didn't speak openly about Kael's treatment, but everyone knew. The question was always whether they approved or simply didn't care enough to intervene. The cook's eyes softened slightly. "There's extra broth in the pot there. Still warm. Won't be missed if someone were to take a cup." Their eyes met, and Elin saw it. The first crack of compassion she'd witnessed from anyone in the pack besides herself. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough. But it was something. "Thank you," Elin whispered. The cook turned away quickly, as if embarrassed by her own moment of humanity. "Get on with you, then." Elin added the broth to her tray and left the kitchen, her heart beating faster than it should. Even these small mercies felt like rebellion in a house where cruelty had become law. She made her way to Kael's chamber, balancing the tray carefully. It was mid-afternoon now, hours after the morning's ritual. Kael would have spent the day alone in his room, as he always did. No tutors, no playmates, no pack gatherings. Just silence and isolation in those four walls. She knocked softly before entering. "Little one, I've brought lunch." Kael was sitting on the floor by the narrow window, his back against the wall. He'd been watching the courtyard below, where other pups his age were training with their parents, learning to shift, to hunt, to be part of the pack he would never truly join. He looked up at her entrance, and the sadness in his 3-year-old eyes was so profound it made her chest ache. "I'm not very hungry," he said quietly. "I know, but you need to eat anyway." She set the tray down and sat beside him on the floor, her skirts pooling around her. "Look what I brought, your favorites." His eyes widened slightly at the sweet roll. "Where did you get that?" "Don't worry about where, just eat." She watched as he took small, careful bites, savoring each morsel as if it might be his last. And he probably thought it could be. In this house, even small kindnesses were unreliable. While he ate, Elin reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the smooth river stone she'd been warming by the kitchen fire all morning. It was almost too hot to touch, but she wrapped it in a cloth and tucked it under the thin blanket on his bed. "There, that should keep you warm tonight." Kael paused mid-bite. "You always do that. Hide the warm stones so Father won't see." "I do." "Why?" His voice was genuinely curious, as if kindness was a foreign concept that required explanation. Elin considered how to answer. "Because you deserve warmth. Because no child should suffer like this. Because someone in this cursed house needs to remember that you're not a monster, you're a little boy. Because you're important to me," she said instead. Kael absorbed this, chewing thoughtfully on his cheese. Then, "The other pups have parents who tuck them in, who tell them stories, who—" He stopped, his small voice catching. "Do you think my mother would have told me stories before nothing," Elin said firmly. "You didn't cause what happened to your mother. Birth is dangerous. Sometimes even the strongest she-wolves don't survive it. That wasn't your fault." But she could see he didn't believe her. How could he, when his own father blamed him every single morning? "Would you like me to tell you a story?" she offered gently. His face brightened immediately. "Yes, please." Elin settled back against the wall, and Kael moved closer, nestling against her side in a way that made her heart clench. She put her arm around his thin shoulders, feeling how cold he always was, even hours after the ice bath. "Once, long ago," she began, "there was a young wolf who was different from all the others in his pack. While they had golden fur that shone in the sunlight, his fur was silver like moonlight on snow. The other wolves said he was wrong, that he didn't belong. They pushed him away and made him sleep outside the den." Kael's breathing had slowed. He was listening intently. The young wolf was lonely and sad. He thought perhaps the others were right. Perhaps he truly was wrong. But then, one terrible winter, a great blizzard came. The cold was so fierce that the golden wolves couldn't hunt, couldn't survive. They huddled in their den, growing weaker and weaker. "What happened?" Kael whispered. "The silver wolf, who had spent so many nights in the cold, had become strong in ways the others never could. He walked through the blizzard as if it were nothing. He hunted when no one else could. And when he returned with food, do you know what he did?" "What?" "He shared it with the pack who had rejected him, because being different didn't mean being cruel. And the golden wolves finally understood. He wasn't wrong. He was exactly what they needed. He was brave when they could not be." Kael was quiet for a long moment, processing the story. Then he tilted his head up to look at her, those strange eyes searching her face. "Am I a brave wolf, Elin?" The question pierced her. She looked down at this child who endured torture every morning without crying, who apologized for existing, who still had gentleness in his heart despite everything. He was braver than any wolf she'd ever known. But that wasn't the truth she saw when she looked at him. When she saw those black veins pulse with that strange inner light, when she felt the unnatural cold that radiated from his skin, when she caught glimpses of something ancient and vast swimming behind his young eyes, she knew he was something far greater than a brave wolf. She just didn't know what yet. "Yes," she lied, pulling him closer. "You're the bravest wolf I know." He smiled then, a real smile, rare and precious. He tucked his head against her shoulder and yawned, the warmth of the food and her presence finally letting him relax. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" he murmured. "Of course." As his breathing deepened and evened out, Elin held him carefully, as if he were made of glass. She hummed an old lullaby her own mother had sung to her, before the fever took her and left Elin alone in the world. Through the window, she could see the sun beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In a few hours, she would need to draw fresh water from the lake for tomorrow's ritual. In a few hours, she would need to prepare herself for the 1097th breaking of her heart. But for now, in this small pocket of stolen time, she could give this child what he deserved: warmth, safety, and the knowledge that someone in this cruel world cared whether he lived or died. Outside, the temperature was dropping as night fell. Elin felt Kael shiver slightly in his sleep, and she adjusted the blanket around him, making sure the warming stone was close. "You're not a brave wolf," she whispered to his sleeping form. "You're something so much more. And someday, if this whole pack is going to realize what they've done to you, someday, little one, they're going to be very, very sorry." The black veins in his arms pulsed faintly with that eerie blue-white light, and for just a moment, frost formed on the window glass despite the warming stone nearby. Elin noticed and said nothing. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Kael's 4th birthday arrived with no celebration, no acknowledgement, nothing to mark the passage of another year except Elin's private grief that he had survived this long. The morning ritual began as it always did: the dark hallway, the silent walk, the courtyard still shrouded in pre-dawn shadows. But when Elin led Kael to the barrel, she noticed something that made her breath catch. The water wasn't still. Small ripples moved across the surface despite the absence of wind, and the ice chunks that floated there had formed into strange geometric patterns, almost like snowflakes, but wrong somehow, too perfect, too deliberate. Kael noticed her hesitation. "Is something wrong?" "No, little one." She forced herself to move forward. "Just the wind." But there was no wind. On the balcony above, Torin watched with the same cold attention he'd maintained for 4 years. If he noticed anything unusual about the water, his face betrayed nothing. Kael climbed into the barrel with the resigned efficiency of long practice, gripping the edges and lowering himself in. The moment his skin touched the water, Elin saw it. A flash of blue light beneath the surface, gone so quickly she almost thought she'd imagined it. Then Kael's black veins flared. They'd always been visible, dark rivers beneath his pale skin, but now they pulsed with an inner luminescence. Faint blue-white light traveled through them like lightning through storm clouds, starting from his chest and radiating outward through his arms, his neck, up to his temples. "I'm sorry I'm dirty, Father," Kael called up, his voice already shaking with cold. "I'm trying to be clean." Elin's hands moved to his shoulders automatically, but she couldn't stop staring at those glowing veins. 4 years she'd been performing this ritual, and they'd never done that before. The 3 minutes stretched out like hours. She counted each second, but her attention kept drifting to Kael's face. His lips were turning blue as they always did, his breath coming in sharp gasps, but there was something different in his expression. Less pain, more awareness. His eyes had closed, but beneath the lids, yet she could see movement. Not the rolling unconsciousness of someone slipping away, but something deliberate, focused. When the 3 minutes ended and she helped him from the water, the barrel's interior had frosted over. Intricate patterns of ice spiraled across the wood, beautiful and impossible. The water itself seemed colder than when it had started, as if Kael had drawn the warmth from it rather than the other way around. Elin wrapped him in the towel quickly, trying to hide the evidence, but Torin's voice cut through the morning air. "Wait!" She froze. The Alpha descended from his balcony, his footsteps deliberate and measured. In 4 years, he had never come down during the ritual. He had always watched from above, distant and untouchable. Now he approached the barrel, his eyes narrowed. He ran one hand along the frosted interior and then pulled it back sharply. "Ice. The water has frozen to the wood." "The temperature has been dropping, my lord," Elin said carefully. "Winter is—" "The water was liquid when he entered." Torin's gaze shifted to his son, and for the first time in years, something other than cold disgust crossed his features. Interest. "Show me your arms, boy." Kael, still shivering in the towel, hesitated. Then he slowly extended his thin arms. The black veins were still faintly luminescent, pulsing with that eerie blue light. Torin stared at them for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he smiled. "It's working." His voice was filled with something approaching wonder. 4 years. 4 years of cleansing, and finally, the rot is responding. It's being drawn out. Elin's blood ran cold. He thought the glow was the curse leaving Kael's body, and not something awakening within it. "The cleansing must intensify," Torin continued, speaking more to himself than to them. "If the rot is finally surfacing, we must purge it completely." "My lord," Elin started, but he cut her off with a gesture. "Colder water. Draw it from the deepest part of the lake, where the ice is thickest, and extend the duration. 5 minutes instead of 3. "He's just a child," Elin whispered, knowing it was futile but unable to stop herself. 5 minutes could purge what killed my mate." Torin's eyes were fever bright. "Look at him. The darkness is literally glowing beneath his skin. It's trying to escape. We must give it no quarter." He turned and strode back toward the castle, energized by his delusion. "Begin the new protocol tomorrow, and report any changes immediately." Elin stood in the courtyard, holding a shivering 4-year-old, and felt despair settle over her like a shroud. She'd hoped that time would soften Torin's madness. Instead, it had only fed it. She carried Kael back to his chamber, her mind racing. 5 minutes. He was already barely surviving 3. Once inside, she dried him off and dressed him in warm clothes, her movements mechanical while her thoughts spiraled. The warming stone was already in his bed, and she tucked him in carefully, pulling the blankets up to his chin. "Elin?" His voice was small. Why did father look happy? How could she explain this? How could she tell him that his father's joy came from believing he was finally succeeding in purging the rot that didn't exist? "He thinks you're getting better," she said instead. Am I sick?" "No, little one. You're not sick." But she looked at his arms, at those black veins still faintly glowing beneath the blankets, and wondered what he actually was. The light was taking longer to fade now. Even an hour after the ice bath, she could still see the faint pulse of blue-white luminescence. She'd seen something else, too, during those 5 terrible minutes. The water around Kael had begun to move in strange currents, spiraling around his small body as if responding to some invisible force. And the ice chunks hadn't just frozen to the barrel. They'd formed patterns that looked almost like runes from the old language, the one that predated the modern Pax. Something was building inside him, something vast and cold and ancient. She didn't have a name for it, didn't have the knowledge to understand it, but she could feel it the way you feel a storm gathering on the horizon. "Will it hurt more?" Kael asked quietly. "Tomorrow when it's longer?" Elin smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her heart breaking. "I don't know, but I'll be there with you. I'll be there the whole time." "You're always there." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers ice cold but somehow not uncomfortable. "Even when father isn't. Even when no one else is. You're always there." "Always," she promised. He fell asleep holding her hand, exhausted from the morning's ordeal. Elin sat beside his bed, watching the black veins pulse with that increasingly bright light, and made a decision. She didn't know what Kael was becoming. She didn't know if Torin's torture was awakening something that should remain dormant, or if it was slowly killing something that could have been magnificent. But she knew she needed answers. That night, after her duties were done and the castle had fallen silent, Elin made her way to the one place she'd been avoiding for 4 years, the restricted archives in the castle's oldest wing, the place where the Pack's most ancient records were kept, the histories that predated even the Alpha's lineage. If there were answers about black veins and ice-cold skin and children who glowed like winter moonlight, they would be there. She just had to be brave enough to find them. The restricted archives were buried in the oldest part of the castle, 3 levels below ground, where the stone walls still bore claw marks from the Pack's founding wars. No one came here anymore. The knowledge stored in this place had been deemed too dangerous, too ancient, or simply too irrelevant for modern wolves who measured power in territory and alliances rather than myths and legends. Elin's hands trembled as she descended the narrow staircase, a single candle her only light. Every shadow seemed to reach for her. Every creak of settling stone sounded like footsteps pursuing. If she was caught here, there would be no mercy. Omega Maids didn't sneak into forbidden places. Omega Maids stayed in their assigned spaces and asked no questions. But Elin had watched Kael's veins glow brighter with each passing day. She'd seen frost spread from his fingertips when he slept. She'd felt the temperature drop in his chamber, even with warming stones placed all around. Whatever was happening to him was accelerating, and Torin's increased brutality was only feeding it. That she needed to understand what he was before it was too late. The archive door was massive oak bound with iron, sealed with a lock that had rusted from disuse. But the key, stolen from the head steward's office with a guilty heart, turned smoothly, and the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty corridors. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old parchment. Shelves stretched into darkness, laden with scrolls and bound volumes that hadn't been touched in decades. Some were falling apart, leather bindings cracked and pages yellowed. Others looked almost pristine, as if the knowledge they contained was too potent to decay. Elin moved between the shelves, her candle casting dancing shadows across titles written in old script. Most were territorial records, bloodline genealogies, treaties from forgotten conflicts, fascinating to historians perhaps, but useless to her. She was about to give up when she noticed a section in the far corner where the dust was particularly thick. These scrolls hadn't been disturbed in so long that cobwebs stretched between them like delicate curtains. The labels were written in an older dialect, one she could barely read, but one word caught her eye: Eaterborn, Winterborn. Her heart hammered as she carefully pulled the scroll from its shelf. The parchment was so old it felt like fabric in her hands, and she had to unroll it with painstaking care to avoid tearing it. The text was handwritten in elegant script, illustrated with images that made her breath catch. Wolves with black veins, wolves standing in snowstorms with their eyes blazing blue, wolves surrounded by ice that seemed to grow from their very bodies. She began to read, squinting in the candlelight. In the First Age, before the Packs claimed the mountains, before the territories were carved and the laws written, there existed wolves who were not merely creatures of this world, but extensions of winter itself. The Eaterborn, the Winterborn, shaped the frozen places, commanded ice and snow as others command their limbs, and held dominion over the coldest reaches where no other life could survive. They were marked from birth with veins of midnight running beneath their skin, vessels that carried not merely blood, but the essence of primordial cold. As they matured and their power awakened, these veins would illuminate with the light of ancient glaciers, blue as deep ice, bright as stars reflected on frozen lakes. Elin's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the scroll. This was Kael. Every word described Kael. She read on. The Winterborn were neither good nor evil in the mortal sense. They simply were, forces of nature given flesh and will. But they were few, and their power was so immense that it unbalanced the world. When the last Winterborn died nearly 1,000 years ago, the bloodline was thought extinct, passed into legend and myth. Yet the old scholars believed the power could lie dormant across generations, sleeping in bloodlines that appeared wholly mortal. If certain signs aligned, a birth during the deepest winter, a death tied to the child's arrival, veins that run black instead of red, the Winterborn might be reborn. Such a child would be fragile in their early years, as their mortal flesh struggling to contain divine essence. But if they survived to awakening, if the power was nurtured rather than suppressed, the text ended there, torn away or deliberately removed. But Elin had read enough. She sat back against the shelf, her mind reeling. Queen Alara. She must have carried this dormant bloodline. And Kael, born during the worst winter storm in living memory, born as his mother died, born with those black veins, he was the first Winterborn in a millennium. Torin wasn't cleansing a curse, he was torturing a god. And the ice baths, meant to purge darkness, were doing the exact opposite. They were awakening Kael's power. Every brutal morning was bringing him closer to the full manifestation of what he truly was. Elin's mind raced through the implications. If Kael fully awakened, what would happen? If the scroll spoke of immense power, of forces that shaped the world, a 4-year-old child with that kind of ability, especially one who had been tortured his entire life, she had to tell someone. She had to stop this before. But who? Who would believe an Omega maid claiming the Alpha's son was an ancient god reborn? Who would risk Torin's wrath based on a dusty scroll from the Forbidden Archives? She thought of Maris, the court physician who had been there the night Kael was born. Maris had seen his black veins, had noted his unnatural coldness. Perhaps she would understand. Perhaps she would help. Elin carefully rolled up the scroll, tucking it into her apron. She would show Maris, make her see the truth. Together, maybe they could... Interesting choice of midnight reading. Elin spun around, nearly dropping her candle. In the doorway stood Gamma Marcus, the pack's third in command. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I was just... Elin's mind went blank. There was no explanation that wouldn't damn her. Marcus stepped into the archive, closing the door behind him. You were just stealing restricted documents and committing a dozen violations that could see you exiled or worse. Elin's throat went dry. Please, I can explain. Can you? He moved closer, and she noticed he looked tired. More than tired, haunted. Can you explain why you've been performing that abomination in the courtyard every morning for 4 years and never once questioned it? Can you explain why the entire pack watches a child being tortured and does nothing? She stared at him, confused by the bitterness in his voice. I followed you, Marcus continued quietly. I've watched you sneak food to the boy, hide warming stones, stay with him when no one else will, and I've done nothing to help because I'm a coward who values his position more than a child's life. He reached out and gently took the scroll from her shaking hands, unrolling it to scan the text. His eyes widened as he read. Gods, he breathed. Winterborn. I thought they were just stories. It's him, Elin whispered. It's Kael. Everything the scroll describes. He's showing all the signs, and Torin's ice baths are awakening it, making it stronger. Marcus looked up at her, his face pale. If this is true, if the boy fully awakens, I don't know what will happen. But I know we can't let Torin continue. 5 minutes now. Tomorrow may be longer. He thinks he's winning against a curse. But he's forging something that could... She stopped, unable to even articulate the possibilities. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing something. Then, the council. We take this to the regional council. They have the authority to override an alpha if his actions endanger the greater pack structure. They'll never believe us. They might if we bring proof. The scroll, testimony about what we've witnessed. If Maris will speak on record about the birth... He stopped, shaking his head. "It's a slim chance, but it's the only chance that doesn't end with you dead and me stripped of rank." Elin wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that there was a path forward that didn't end in tragedy. But she looked at the scroll, at the illustrations of wolves who commanded winter itself, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Somewhere above them, in a cold chamber at the end of the east wing, a 4-year-old boy slept with black veins pulsing brighter each night, his small body containing power that had reshaped the world once before. And in less than 6 hours, his father would drag him to the courtyard and feed that power once again. Alpha Darius of the Northridge Pack arrived with the autumn equinox, bringing a delegation of warriors and advisors for the seasonal territory negotiations. He was a formidable wolf, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, with a reputation for fairness that made him respected even among rival packs. Elin watched from the servants' entrance as the welcoming ceremony unfolded in the Great Hall. Torin played his role perfectly. The gracious host, the strong leader, every inch the alpha who commanded one of the most prosperous territories in the region. No one watching would suspect the darkness that lived in this castle. The visiting wolves would stay for 3 days. 3 days of negotiations, feasts, and carefully orchestrated displays of pack strength and unity. 3 days during which the morning ritual would continue, and because Torin had never once broken his routine, not even for matters of state. Elin felt sick thinking about it. The first morning of the visit, she led Kael to the courtyard even earlier than usual, hoping to finish before the visiting pack stirred. But autumn meant later dawns, and they were still in the middle of the ritual when she heard footsteps approaching. Alpha Darius emerged from the castle's side entrance, clearly intending to take an early morning walk through the grounds. He stopped dead when he saw them. Kael was in the barrel, submerged to his shoulders, his lips already blue and his black veins glowing with that increasingly bright light. Elin had her hands on his shoulders, counting the seconds until she could pull him out. On the balcony above, Torin stood in his usual position, watching. For a moment, no one moved. The tableau held, a child in freezing water, a maid's trembling hands, an alpha's cold observation, and a stranger bearing witness to something he clearly couldn't comprehend. "What in the name of the moon goddess?" Darius's voice was hoarse with shock. He strode forward, his eyes moving from the barrel to Torin and back again. "What is this?" "A private matter," Torin called down, his voice flat. "I suggest you return to your chambers, Alpha Darius." "Private?" Darius had reached the barrel now, and his face paled as he took in Kael's condition. The unnatural cold radiating from the child, the glowing veins, the chunks of ice floating in the water. "This is a child, in freezing water, while you watch." The 5 minutes weren't up yet, but Elin made a decision. She pulled Kael from the barrel, wrapping him quickly in the towel. The boy was shaking violently, his eyes unfocused, but he didn't cry. He never cried anymore. "This child is my son." Torin descended from the balcony, his movements deliberate and controlled. "And how I choose to raise him is not your concern." "Your son?" Darius looked between them, horror dawning on his features. "You're doing this to your own pup?" "I'm cleansing him of the rot that killed his mother." Torin's voice held no emotion, as if he were discussing crop management or border patrols. "It's a necessary ritual, performed daily since his birth." Darius took a step back, his hand moving instinctively to his chest, as if to protect his own heart from what he was hearing. "That's your son, not a prisoner, not some criminal to be tortured. He's 4 years old, Torin." "Oh, 4. He's a curse given flesh." The words fell like stones into deep water. Elin clutched Kael tighter, feeling the boy trembling against her. "Look at him," Torin continued, gesturing to Kael's exposed arms where the black veins pulsed with blue light. "Those veins are unnatural. His skin is cold as death itself. My mate was healthy and strong until she carried him, and then she died screaming while this thing drained her life away." "So your solution is to drown him slowly every morning?" Darius's voice was rising, his alpha authority pushing against Torin's. To traumatize and torture your own blood? Every day he lives is a mercy I grant him. Torin's eyes were cold and certain. Every breath he takes is more than he deserves. The cleansing is his only path to redemption. The silence that followed was suffocating, and Elin could hear Kael's ragged breathing, could feel his small body shaking with cold and fear. Around them, other pack members had begun to emerge, drawn by the raised voices. They gathered in doorways and windows, watching but not interfering. Darius looked around at them, seeing their averted gazes and guilty faces. "You all know about this. You've all stood by and let this happen." No one answered. The shame was palpable, thick as fog, but shame wasn't enough to breed courage. "I thought your pack was better than this," Darius said quietly, his disappointment cutting deeper than anger could. "I thought you were better than this, Torin. We fought together in the border wars. I've known you for 20 years, but this—" He shook his head. "This isn't justice. This isn't even sane." "Then leave." Torin's voice was ice. "Hey, go back to your territory and your soft philosophies about parenting. You don't know what it's like to lose your mate. You don't understand what must be done." "You're right. I don't understand torturing children." Darius turned to leave, then paused. "The council will hear about this, Torin. What you're doing here, it violates every law we have about the treatment of pups, even ones you believe are cursed. The council has no authority over how I raise my son. We'll see about that." Darius strode away, his delegation scrambling to follow. Within the hour, they had packed and departed, the negotiations abandoned. Elin watched from Kael's window as the Northridge wolves left, their departure hasty and tense. She'd gotten Kael dressed and into bed, but he was still shivering despite the warming stones, and his black veins continued to pulse with that eerie light, brighter now than ever before. "Why was that alpha angry?" Kael asked quietly. Elin didn't know how to answer. How do you tell a child that a stranger showed more concern for his welfare in 5 minutes than his own father had in 4 years? "He didn't understand," she said finally. "Understand what?" "That you need to be clean." Kael absorbed this, his small face thoughtful. Then, "Elin, am I really dirty? Is there something wrong inside me?" Her heart shattered. "No, little one, there's nothing wrong with you." But even as she said it, she watched the blue light pulse through his veins and wondered if she was lying. Not because there was rot in him, but because there was something so immense, so powerful, that it might destroy them all when it finally broke free. That evening, Elin was returning from the kitchens when she heard voices in one of the side corridors. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. "Can't continue like this." It was Gamma Marcus. "Darius will report to the council when they investigate. If they investigate." That was Beta Soren, the pack's second in command. The council moved slowly. It could be months before they act. The boy might not have months. A third voice, one of the senior warriors. "Have you seen him lately? Those veins are getting brighter. Whatever Torin thinks he's cleansing, it's getting stronger, not weaker." "We should report it ourselves," Marcus said. "Get ahead of this before—" "Before what? Before Torin finds out we betrayed him?" Soren's voice was bitter. "He's still our alpha. We swore oaths." "We also swore to protect the pack. And if that child is what the old scroll says, if he's truly winterborn and Torin's torture is awakening his power, then we're all in danger," the warrior finished. "Gods, winterborn. I thought they were myths." "So did I," Marcus said grimly. "But I saw the scroll. I've watched the boy change. This is real, and it's happening now." There was a long pause. Then Soren, "We report to the council, anonymously, through channels that can't be traced back to us. We tell them everything, the daily torture, the ancient bloodline, the danger of full awakening. Let them decide." "And if they're too late?" No one answered that question. Elin slipped away before they could discover her, her mind racing. The council was being contacted. Help might be coming. But Marcus was right. It might not arrive in time. She thought of Kael. Is sleeping in his chamber with those glowing veins, his small body containing power that had once shaped the world. She thought of Torin, more convinced than ever that his daily torture was righteous. And she thought of what the scroll had said. If they survived to awakening, if the power was nurtured rather than suppressed, what happened when power wasn't nurtured but beaten down, frozen, traumatized daily for 4 years? What kind of God would emerge from that crucible? Elin didn't know, but she had a terrible feeling they were all about to find out. The change in Kael was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as exhaustion or the natural quietness of a traumatized child. But Elin had spent 4 years learning every nuance of his expressions, every shift in his voice, and she noticed when something fundamental began to alter. And it started with the apologies. "I'm sorry I'm dirty, Father. I'm trying to be clean." The words were the same, spoken every morning as he lowered himself into the ice water. But the tone had shifted. Where before there had been desperate pleading, a child's genuine hope that he might earn his father's love, now there was only hollow repetition. He spoke the phrase like a prayer in a language he no longer understood, performing ritual without belief. Elin noticed it one morning when she was helping him dress after the bath. His black veins were glowing brighter than ever, the blue light so intense it cast shadows on the walls. She'd wrapped him in towels and blankets, but he wasn't shivering the way he used to. "Are you warm enough, little one?" she asked. He looked at her, and for a moment she didn't recognize what she saw in his eyes. They'd always been unusual, too knowing, too ancient, but there had still been warmth there. Humanity. Now they seemed distant, as if he was looking at her from very far away. "I'm never warm," he said simply. "I don't think I'm supposed to be." The matter-of-fact way he said it chilled her more than any winter wind. Over the following weeks, the distance grew. He still accepted her kindness, the hidden food, the warming stones, the whispered stories, but he received them with detachment, like a king accepting tribute from a servant, rather than a child accepting love from the only person who cared. He stopped asking questions, stopped wondering about his mother, about the other pups, about why his father hated him. It was as if those human concerns were falling away, replaced by something else, something colder. The pack noticed too. And the few servants who still had occasion to see him reported that he watched them with unsettling intensity, his glowing eyes tracking their movements with predatory focus. One maid quit after encountering him in the corridor late at night, claiming his gaze had frozen her in place until he'd simply walked past as if she didn't exist. "He's not right," she'd told the head steward, her hands shaking. "There's something in that boy that isn't a boy anymore." Elin wanted to argue, wanted to defend him, but she couldn't, because she felt it too, the growing sense that Kael was becoming something other. The humanity she'd tried so hard to preserve was slipping away with each ice bath, each moment of suffering, each day of isolation. The morning it truly broke was in late autumn, as when frost covered the courtyard in delicate patterns and the barrel's water had started freezing overnight, despite being drawn fresh each dawn. Torin had ordered the submersion extended to 7 minutes now. 7 minutes of a 4-year-old child held in freezing water while his father watched for signs of the rot being purged. Elin had begged Marcus to intervene, to use his position to convince Torin to stop, but the Gamma could only shake his head helplessly. "The council is deliberating," he'd told her. "Darius's report has raised concerns, but these things take time, official investigations, testimonies, legal procedures. Kael doesn't have time." Marcus had no answer for that. So Elin led Kael to the courtyard that morning, her heart heavy with dread. The boy walked beside her in silence, and his black veins already glowing faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. He'd stopped holding her hand weeks ago. The water in the barrel had a thin layer of ice over it despite being drawn just hours before. Elin had to break through it with her fist, the cold stinging her skin. Above, Torin stood on his balcony, wrapped in furs against the morning chill. Kael climbed into the barrel without hesitation, without the slight pause that used to mark his fear. He simply stepped in and submerged himself to the shoulders, his expression blank. "I'm sorry I'm dirty, Father," he called up, but the words were mechanical, empty. "I'm trying to be clean." Elin placed her hands on his shoulders and began counting. The cold radiating from him was intense, stronger than the water itself. Ice began forming on the barrel's edges within seconds, auto-spreading in those same intricate patterns she'd seen before. 1 minute. Kael's veins blazed bright blue, light pulsing through them like lightning through storm clouds. 2 minutes. The water around him began to move in strange currents, spiraling patterns that defied the laws of nature. 3 minutes. Frost spread from the barrel across the courtyard stones, reaching toward the castle walls. 4 minutes. Elin's hands were going numb from the cold radiating off Kael's shoulders, but she couldn't pull away. The ritual demanded 7 minutes. 5 minutes. Kael's eyes opened beneath the water. They glowed the same brilliant blue as his veins, illuminating the dark water like twin stars. 6 minutes. The temperature in the courtyard plummeted. Elin's breath came out in frozen clouds, and guards watching from the walls pulled their cloaks tighter. Even Torin, high on his balcony, shifted uncomfortably. 7 minutes. Elin pulled her hands away, ready to help Kael from the water, but he didn't need her help. He stood up on his own, water streaming off him in sheets that froze midair into crystalline curtains. The barrel cracked, ice spreading through the wood like veins through flesh. He stepped out onto the frozen courtyard, and where his bare feet touched the stone, ice spread in perfect geometric patterns. Then he looked up at his father. No apology, no plea for approval, no desperate attempt to earn love, just a long, level stare from eyes that burned with blue fire. Torin stared back, and for the first time in 4 years, something other than cold certainty crossed his face. His eyes widened slightly. His hand gripped the balcony railing tighter. Fear. He was afraid of his son. The moment stretched between them, father and child locked in silent confrontation across the frozen courtyard. Pack members had gathered in windows and doorways, drawn by the unnatural cold. They watched, breathless, as the 4-year-old boy with glowing veins stood facing the alpha, who had tortured him every day of his life. Kael said nothing. He simply stood there, water and ice dripping from his small frame, and stared at his father with eyes that held no humanity, no mercy, no warmth, just ancient, terrible cold. Finally, Torin broke the silence. Good. His voice was rough, uncertain, trying to regain control. The rot is being forced out. I can see it in your eyes, the darkness revealing itself. We're close now. Close to purging it completely. He turned and disappeared into the castle, but Elin had seen his hands shaking on the railing, had seen the way he'd stepped back from the balcony edge, as if afraid his son might somehow reach him across that distance. The alpha was frightened, but his madness wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he'd twisted his fear into validation, convinced himself that Kael's growing power was proof the curse was surfacing, that his torture was working. Elin wrapped a towel around Kael's shoulders, but he shrugged it off. I don't need it, he said quietly. The cold doesn't hurt anymore. She looked at him, really looked at him. His skin had taken on a faint blue tint, as if ice ran beneath it instead of blood. His black veins glowed steadily now, no longer pulsing but burning with constant light, and his eyes, when he turned them to her, held nothing of the warm child who had asked if he was a brave wolf. Kael, she whispered. Can you hear me? Are you still in there? He tilted his head, studying her with that unsettling intensity. I've always been here, Elin. I'm just becoming more of what I was meant to be. And what's that? He smiled, and it was the saddest thing she'd ever seen. Not cruel, not cold, but infinitely melancholy. The smile of something ancient that remembered being human and mourned the loss. I don't know yet, he said, but I think we're all about to find out. He walked back to the castle alone, leaving footprints of ice that didn't melt even when the sun finally rose. Elin stood in the courtyard, surrounded by frost patterns and the shattered remains of the barrel, and felt the weight of approaching catastrophe settle over her like a shroud. The breaking point was coming. She could feel it the way animals feel earthquakes before they strike. And when it came, she knew that nothing, not the pack, not the council, not even Torin's stubborn madness, would be able to stop what had been building for 4 years. Winter was coming, and it had a 4-year-old face. The morning of Kael's 4th birthday began like every other morning, in darkness, in silence, in ritual. But the air itself felt different, charged with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. Elin knew something was going to break today. She'd felt it building all week, a pressure in her chest that had nothing to do with her own fear and everything to do with the way reality seemed to bend around Kael now. The way frost followed him through corridors, the way shadows lengthened when he passed, the way the very stones of the castle seemed to hold their breath in his presence. She knocked on his door and entered to find him already dressed, standing by the window and watching the pre-dawn sky. His black veins glowed steadily beneath his skin, bright enough to illuminate his small chamber without need for candles. "It's time," she said softly. He turned to her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in weeks. Awareness, recognition, as if he'd been somewhere far away and had suddenly returned to himself. "Elin," he said, and his voice was his own again, not the distant mechanical tone he'd adopted. "I dreamed about my mother last night." Her breath caught. "What did you dream?" She was standing in snow, so much snow, and she was smiling at me. His small hand pressed against the cold glass. "She said I shouldn't be afraid of what I am. She said the cold is a gift, not a curse." "Little one." She said today everything changes. He looked at her then, and there were tears in his glowing eyes. She said it would hurt, but then I would understand. A chill ran down Elin's spine that had nothing to do with temperature. Understand what? But Kael had already turned away, moving toward the door with that same resigned purpose he'd shown for 4 years. "We shouldn't keep Father waiting." They walked through the corridors in silence. Elin wanted to grab him, to run, to flee the castle and this territory and everything that was coming. But where could they go? What sanctuary existed for a maid and a child who might be a god? The courtyard was waiting. The barrel was waiting. And on the balcony above, wrapped in the finest furs, Alpha Torin was waiting. But this morning, he wasn't alone. Beta Soren stood beside him, and several senior pack members had gathered as well, drawn by some instinct that today would be significant. Elin saw Marcus among them, his face drawn and pale. The barrel's water was darker than usual, drawn from the deepest part of the lake where sunlight never reached. Ice chunks floated in it like jagged teeth, and even from several feet away, Elin could feel the cold radiating from it. Kael walked to the barrel's edge and looked down into the black water. His reflection stared back at him, veins glowing blue against pale skin. "Today we finish this," Torin's voice rang out across the courtyard. 4 years of cleansing, and still the rot persists. But I can see it trying to escape now, glowing beneath his skin like infections seeking the surface. Elin's hands clenched into fists. Even now, even seeing what was plainly obvious, Torin maintained his delusion. "Today you will hold him under," the Alpha continued, his words falling like sentence and judgment, "until I say stop. However long that takes, the rot will be purged completely, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elin looked at Marcus, silently pleading for intervention, but he shook his head minutely. The council hadn't responded yet. There was no help coming. She turned to Kael, kneeling beside him, so their eyes were level. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for all of it." He reached out and touched her face with one ice-cold hand. "Don't be. How you were the only warmth I ever knew." He smiled that sad, ancient smile. "Remember that, when this is over. Remember you were kind when no one else was." Before she could respond, he climbed into the barrel. The water accepted him like a lover, wrapping around his small body. He looked up at her, at his father, at the assembled pack bearing witness to this final horror. "I'm sorry I'm dirty, Father," he said, one last time. "I'm trying to be clean." Then he looked at Elin and nodded. She placed her hands on his shoulders and pushed him under. The water closed over his head. Bubbles rose. His black hair floated around his face like dark silk. His glowing veins pulsed once, twice, then began to brighten. 1 minute. Kael's small body went rigid beneath her hands. 2 minutes. The water began to glow from within, illuminated by the light spreading through his veins. 3 minutes. Elin's arms were shaking. Her tears fell into the barrel, freezing before they touched the water. 4 minutes. The glowing stopped. The water went completely still, and beneath Elin's hands, Kael's struggling ceased entirely. He'd gone limp. "Alpha?" Elin gasped, looking up at Torin. "Alpha, please." "Hold him," Torin commanded, leaning over the balcony railing. "The rot is being forced out. I can feel it." "He's not breathing." "Hold him," Elin sobbed, her hands refusing to move, even as her mind screamed at her to pull him up. 4 minutes. No child could survive 4 minutes underwater. She'd killed him. After 4 years of trying to protect him, of hiding warming stones and stealing food and whispering stories, she'd been the one to finally... The water exploded. And not outward, but inward, collapsing toward Kael's submerged form as if he'd become a singularity, pulling everything into himself. The ice chunks shattered into powder. The wooden barrel groaned, its iron bands screaming as they contracted. Then everything went still. Kael stood up. Water streamed off him, but it wasn't falling. It was freezing in midair, creating curtains of ice that hung suspended around him like wings. His eyes opened, and they were no longer the eyes of a child. They blazed with blue fire, ancient and vast and absolutely inhuman. His black veins were black no longer. They burned with light so bright, Elin had to shield her eyes. Blue-white radiance that pulsed through him like lightning through storm clouds, like the northern lights given flesh. The temperature plummeted. Elin's breath turned to ice crystals before her face. Frost spread from Kael's feet across the courtyard in intricate, beautiful patterns. Fractals upon fractals. Mathematical perfection that no natural ice could create. The barrel shattered. Not cracked. Shattered, exploding into 1,000 pieces that hung frozen in the air around him. Kael stepped out onto the courtyard stones, and where his bare feet touched, ice bloomed like flowers. It spread across the ground, up the walls, across every surface it could reach. The pack members in the windows stumbled back as frost coated the glass. Guards on the walls watched their weapons freeze in their hands. The boy, the godchild, stood in the center of it all, wreathed in frozen light, and looked up at his father. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of glaciers, and the finality of winter itself. "I'm clean now, Father." Each word frosted the air. "Are you pleased?" On the balcony, Torin had gone white. His hands gripped the railing so tightly Elin could see them shaking even from the courtyard below. The other pack members had fallen to their knees, instinct overwhelming reason in the face of divine presence. Only Marcus remained standing, his eyes wide with awe and terror in equal measure. The ice continued to spread. It climbed the castle walls like living things, beautiful and terrible. The sky itself seemed to darken, clouds gathering with unnatural speed. The temperature dropped further, and further still, until breathing hurt, until movement became difficult. Kael looked around at the pack, at the wolves who had watched him suffer for 4 years and done nothing, and at the guards who had turned away from his screams, at the servants who had whispered their pity but offered no help. "You wanted me clean," he said softly, his child's voice threading through that vast, terrible power. "You wanted the rot gone. Look at me." He raised his small hands, and ice crystallized from nothing, swirling around him in complex geometries. "Am I clean enough now?" Elin, still kneeling where she'd been holding him under, looked up at this being who had been the gentle child she'd tried to save. "Kael," she whispered, "please." He turned those blazing eyes to her, and for just a moment, just one heartbeat, she saw him, the real him. The boy who had asked if he was brave, who had thanked her for warming stones, who had dreamed of his mother. "Thank you, Elin," he said, and his voice was kind. For everything." Then he looked back up at his father, and the kindness vanished, replaced by something ancient and pitiless and cold as the death of stars. "Father," Kael said, "we need to talk." The pack emerged from the castle like ghosts drawn to a haunting, silent, terrified, unable to look away. Mothers clutched pups who had never known true cold, their small bodies shivering despite thick fur. Warriors who had faced enemies in battle stood frozen, not from Kael's power, but from the primitive instinct that recognized a predator so far above them in the hierarchy of nature that resistance was meaningless. The courtyard had become a cathedral of ice. Frost climbed the walls in spiraling patterns that hurt to look at, too perfect, too intentional, like glimpses into the mathematical heart of winter itself. Thus the sky overhead had gone dark despite the approaching dawn, clouds churning in patterns that no natural weather could create, and in the center of it all stood a 4-year-old boy who had stopped being just a boy the moment he rose from the water. Kael hadn't moved. He simply stood there, barefoot on the frozen stones, wrapped in light that pulsed through his veins like the heartbeat of winter. Ice crystallized in the air around him, forming and reforming in endless geometric variations, snowflakes that existed for seconds before dissolving back into the cold from which they came. Torin descended from the balcony, his steps slow and measured, but Elin could see the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes kept widening and then forcing themselves back to composure. The Alpha was trying to maintain authority in the face of something that rendered authority meaningless. He reached the courtyard floor and approached his son, stopping several feet away as if proximity to Kael might freeze him solid. "What are you?" The words came out hoarse, uncertain, everything Torin had never allowed himself to be. Kael tilted his head, studying his father with those blazing blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice layered over itself, a child's voice underscored by something vast and ancient, like listening to someone speak from the bottom of a frozen lake. "I am what you made me, Father. 4 years of ice water, 4 years of cold, 4 years of teaching me that I was nothing but rot that needed to be cleansed." He raised one small hand, and frost spiraled up from the ground to dance around his fingers. You wanted the darkness gone. You wanted me pure. You wanted me clean." He stepped forward, and Torin actually stepped back. "Look at me, Father. Am I clean enough now?" The pack watched, transfixed. Some had fallen to their knees without conscious decision, driven by instincts that predated language. Others pressed themselves against walls, as far from Kael as the courtyard allowed. But none fled. Something in his presence held them captive. Elin saw it happening, saw the realization slowly breaking across Torin's face like ice cracking on a frozen lake. His eyes moved from Kael's glowing veins to the frost patterns spreading across every surface, to the impossible cold that radiated from his son's small body, to the power that bent reality simply by existing. "The rot," Torin's voice was barely a whisper. "As the curse, there was no curse." Kael's words fell like sentence and judgment. "There was never any rot. There was only me, trying to become what I was meant to be. And you," his eyes blazed brighter, "you tortured me, every single day, every single morning. You took a child who wanted nothing but your love, and you drowned him in ice water while telling him he was filthy. Wrong, unworthy of life." The temperature dropped further. Elin's breath crystallized instantly, falling as snow before reaching the ground. Around the courtyard, wolves began to shake uncontrollably, their fur providing no protection against cold that came from something beyond nature. "I apologize to you every morning," Kael continued, his child's voice cracking with emotion even as the ancient power remained steady. "I begged you to see me as clean. Yeah, I tried so hard to be what you wanted, and you just kept. For a moment, he was just a 4-year-old boy again, a child who had been hurt beyond measure, who had suffered without understanding why. Tears froze on his cheeks the moment they fell, tiny diamonds catching the light from his veins. Then the moment passed, and the godchild returned. "But you were right about one thing, Father. I am different. I carry power you can't comprehend. I am Winterborn, the first in 1,000 years. My mother died bringing me into this world because mortal flesh cannot contain what I am. And every time you plunged me into that ice water, thinking you were cleansing a curse—" He smiled, and it was terrible in its sadness. "You were crowning a king of winter." Torin's legs gave out. The Alpha fell to his knees on the frozen stones, and all pretense of strength abandoning him. His face had gone slack with horror as the full weight of his mistake crushed down upon him. "Elara," he breathed, "your mother, she had black veins. Before we mated, just faint marks on her wrists. She said they were birthmarks. I never thought—" "She carried the bloodline," Kael confirmed, "dormant for generations, waiting. And when she gave birth to me, when she poured everything she had into bringing me into this world, the power recognized itself." He looked down at his father kneeling before him. "She didn't die from a curse. She died giving birth to a god." The pack had gone utterly silent. Even breathing seemed too loud in the presence of this revelation. Torin raised his eyes to his son, and Elin saw something in them she'd never witnessed before. Tears. I killed you," the Alpha whispered. "Every morning I was trying to kill you. I thought I was saving the pack from darkness. I thought I was making you clean, but I was just torturing your son." Kael's voice held no mercy. "Because you couldn't accept that your mate died for a reason, that her death had meaning, that I was worth what it cost to bring me here." The ice around Kael began to pulse, spreading faster now. It climbed higher on the walls, coated the ground in layers thick enough to crack stone. The power was building, feeding on emotion and pain, and 4 years of accumulated suffering. Elin saw it happening, saw the moment when grief and rage and divine power would combine into something catastrophic, saw the instant when Kael would stop being a hurt child and become pure, destructive winter. So she stepped forward. "Kael." His blazing eyes turned to her, and the force of his attention nearly drove her to her knees. But she held steady, moving between father and son, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "Don't," she said simply. "Don't?" His voice cracked like breaking ice. "He tortured me, Elin. He called me rot. He tried to drown me every single day of my life. He deserves justice," she agreed. "He deserves to answer for what he's done, but not like this." She glanced back at Torin, still kneeling, broken. "Not from you." "Why not?" The power around Kael intensified. "I could freeze him solid. I could turn this entire territory into a glacier, and I could make them all understand what it feels like to be cold and alone and hurting every single day." "Because you're better than that." Elin's voice was steady despite her terror. "Because in all the stories I told you, the brave wolves didn't become the monsters who hurt them. They chose mercy. They chose to be more than their pain." "I'm not a wolf!" The courtyard shook with his anguish. "I'm not even really a child anymore. I'm Winterborn. I'm ancient power given flesh. You're Kael," Elin interrupted gently. "You're the boy who thanked me for warming stones, who listened to stories and asked if he was brave, who dreamed of his mother last night and cried when he woke up. That's who you are, not this." She gestured at the frozen wasteland the courtyard had become. "This is what was done to you. But it doesn't have to be who you become." The silence that followed was absolute. The pack held its collective breath. Torin remained frozen on his knees, and Kael, godchild, winterborn, tortured son, stood trembling with power and pain in equal measure. "He has to pay," Kael whispered, his child's voice breaking through the ancient resonance. "He has to answer for what he did." "Then let him answer to those with authority over him," Marcus spoke up, stepping forward carefully. "The council is already investigating. Let them judge. Let justice be done properly, not in rage." Kael looked at Marcus, then at the assembled pack, then finally at his father. Torin met his son's gaze, and what passed between them was too complex for words. Recognition, regret, horror, and the terrible knowledge that some things can never be forgiven, has only survived. I could kill you all, Kael said quietly. Every single wolf who watched and did nothing, every servant who turned away, every guard who heard me shivering and closed their ears. I could freeze this entire pack solid, and no power in this world could stop me. The threat hung in the frozen air, real and terrifying. Then Kael's small shoulders sagged, and some of the divine light dimmed. But Elin is right. If I do that, I become what you thought I was. A curse, a monster, something that destroys because it was destroyed. He looked at Elin with eyes that held both gratitude and infinite sadness. I'm not your brave wolf, Elin. I never was. His voice was soft now, tired. I'm something older and colder and more dangerous than any story, but I can choose what I do with that. I can choose not to be like him. He turned and began walking toward the castle, each step leaving perfect ice crystals in his wake. The pack parted before him like a sea, pressing themselves against walls to avoid even his shadow. At the entrance, he paused and looked back. The pack will answer to the council for what happened here. Father will answer for what he's done, and I... He touched the doorframe, and ice spread across it in delicate tracery. I need to understand what I am, what I'm becoming. Then he was gone, disappearing into the castle's depths. The moment he vanished, the pressure lifted slightly. Wolves gasped for air. The temperature rose a few degrees, though the courtyard remained frozen solid. Torin still knelt on the ice, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "What have I done?" he whispered. Oh gods, what have I done?" Elin looked at him, this alpha who had broken his own son in the name of grief, and felt nothing but exhausted pity. "You tortured a god," she said quietly, "and now we all have to live with what comes next." The castle held its breath. 3 days had passed since Kael walked away from the frozen courtyard, since he disappeared into the depths of the castle with ice spreading in his wake. 3 days of waiting for the catastrophe that never came. 3 days of whispers and terror and the slow, creeping realization that the monster they had created was choosing restraint. But restraint was not forgiveness, and the pack was learning the difference. The temperature had not returned to normal. Winter had claimed the territory with a permanence that defied season and logic. Frost coated every surface, as beautiful and unrelenting. The very air hurt to breathe. Pack members huddled around fires that seemed to give less warmth each day, as if the cold was learning to devour heat itself. And at the center of it all, in the chamber at the end of the east wing that had been his prison for 4 years, Kael sat alone. Elin found him there on the 3rd morning, perched on the windowsill with his knees drawn to his chest. The room had transformed completely. Ice covered the walls in intricate murals. Scenes from the stories she had told him, rendered in frozen detail so perfect they seemed alive. The silver wolf walking through the blizzard, the brave pup facing down the bear, the mother wolf protecting her young. All her stories, preserved in ice by a child who had nothing else to hold on to. He didn't look up when she entered, as though she knew he sensed her presence. The blue light from his veins illuminated the room with the quality of moonlight on snow, cold, beautiful, inhuman. "You haven't eaten," she said quietly, noting the untouched trays stacked by the door. "I don't need to anymore." His voice was distant, layered with that vast resonance that made him sound like winter itself speaking through a child's throat. "Food is for bodies that burn energy to stay warm. I am the cold. I don't burn anything. I just am." Elin moved closer, careful not to touch anything. Even the air around him felt dangerous, charged with power that might freeze her solid without malice, simply because that was its nature. "The council is coming," she told him. "They'll be here by nightfall. Alpha Darius is leading them." "Good." He still didn't look at her. "Let them come. Let them see what their laws couldn't protect. Let them bear witness to their failure. Kael, do you know what I've been doing these 3 days, Elin?" He finally turned to face her, and his eyes blazed with that terrible blue fire. I've been remembering all of it, every morning, every moment of cold, every time I begged him to see me as clean, and he just watched. His small hands clenched into fists, and frost spread across the windowsill in jagged patterns. I could freeze him, my father. I could turn him into a statue of ice and let him stand in that courtyard forever, watching nothing, feeling nothing, just as cold and empty as he made me feel. You could, Elin agreed quietly. You have that power, probably more. Then why haven't I? The question broke on a sob, the first truly childlike sound he'd made in days. Why am I still sitting here, letting him live, when he deserves to suffer the way I suffered? Elin moved to sit beside him on the windowsill, close enough to feel the cold radiating from his small body, but not touching. Physical contact might be fatal now, might trigger the power that lurked beneath his skin, waiting for an excuse to unleash. Because you're not him, she said. Because somewhere in all that power, in all that justified rage, there's still a little boy who asked me if he was a brave wolf. Kael was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm not that boy anymore, Elin. I can't be. The things I know now, the power I carry, it changes you. Every time I close my eyes, I see glaciers forming and mountains being carved by ice. I remember 1,000 winters that happened before I was born. I am winterborn, and that means... He stopped, struggling with words that couldn't capture the immensity of what he had become. It means you contain multitudes, Elin finished gently. Ancient power and a child's hurt, divine strength and mortal kindness. You can be both, Kael. You can hold all of it. Can I? He looked at her with eyes that held centuries. Or will the power devour everything else until I'm just... winter? Just cold and pitiless and... Footsteps in the corridor interrupted him. Heavy, measured, approaching with the weight of inevitability. Torin appeared in the doorway. The alpha looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and red-rimmed from either lack of sleep or tears, possibly both. He stood in the threshold as if afraid to enter, and as if his son's chamber had become sacred ground that he was no longer worthy to tread. Kael, he said, and his voice cracked on the name. I came to... Words failed him. How do you apologize for 4 years of torture? How do you express regret for trying to murder your own son every single morning while calling it cleansing? Kael stood slowly, turning to face his father. The temperature in the room dropped further, frost spreading from his feet in warning. Elin felt her breath freezing in her lungs. You came to what? Kael's voice was quiet, dangerous. Apologize? Explain? Tell me you were grieving and didn't know what you were doing? Torin flinched, but held his ground. All of that. None of it. Nothing I say can change what I did. But I need you to know. Need? The word cracked like breaking ice. You need? Sent for 4 years, I needed you to see me, to recognize that I was your son, not a curse. I needed warmth and safety and love, and instead you gave me ice and pain and the certainty that I was worthless. So forgive me, Father, if I don't particularly care what you need. The power around Kael intensified. The ice murals on the walls began to glow with inner light. The very foundations of the castle groaned as if the weight of winter itself was pressing down. Elin saw it happening, saw the moment when Kael's control would shatter, when divine rage would consume the last remnants of the gentle child she'd tried to protect. But then Torin did something she never expected. He fell to his knees, not the controlled descent from the courtyard, not the stunned collapse of 3 days ago. This was total surrender, a man breaking completely, all pretense of strength and authority abandoning him. He pressed his forehead to the frozen floor, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with anguish. You're right. You're absolutely right. I gave you nothing but pain, and I called it love. I took my grief at losing Alara, and I turned it into a weapon against an innocent child who never asked to be born, who never deserved any of what I did. Tears fell from his eyes, freezing before they hit the floor. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm not asking you to understand or to stop hating me. You have every right to your rage." He looked up, meeting his son's blazing eyes. "I just need you to know that I see you now. Finally, after 4 years of willful blindness, I see you." Kael stood frozen, literally and metaphorically, staring down at his father's prostrate form, as the power swirling around him flickered uncertainly, responding to emotions too complex for divine essence to process. "You see me," Kael repeated slowly. "Now, after I manifested enough power to destroy this entire territory, after I became something you can't ignore or dismiss or torture away, that's when you finally see me?" "Yes." Torin's voice was broken glass. "And that makes it worse, doesn't it? That I only recognized your worth when you became powerful enough to demand recognition, that I couldn't see the value in a helpless child who just wanted his father's love." He was sobbing now, great heaving gasps that shook his entire frame. "I destroyed you. I took the son your mother died bringing into this world, and I tried to erase you. I'm a monster, Kael. Not you. Never you. Me." The silence that followed was absolute, as even the ice seemed to stop growing, as if winter itself was holding its breath. Kael walked forward slowly, his bare feet making no sound on the frozen floor. He stopped directly in front of his father, looking down at this man who had been the source of all his suffering, all his pain, all his doubt. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, the voice of a 4-year-old child, stripped of divine resonance, naked with vulnerability. "If I'm not dirty anymore, if there's no rot left to cleanse, will you love me now, Father?" The question shattered something in the room. Elin felt it break. The last fragile barrier between power and humanity, between God and child, between what Kael had become and what he still desperately wanted to be. Torin's head jerked up, his eyes meeting his son's, and what he saw there destroyed him completely. And not the blazing divine fury, not the Winterborn who could reshape the world with a thought, just a little boy who still, after everything, wanted his father to care about him. "Oh, gods!" The words were barely audible. "Oh, my son, my son." He reached out, and Kael didn't pull away. Torin's hand, rough from years of fighting, scarred from countless battles, touched Kael's cheek with infinite gentleness, despite the cold that burned like fire. "You were never dirty. You were never rot. You were always worthy of love. Always. From the moment you drew breath, you deserved everything I denied you." Tears streamed down Torin's face. "I should have loved you unconditionally. I should have protected you. I should have been your father instead of your executioner." Kael's lips trembled. The blue light in his veins flickered, dimming and brightening erratically as he struggled with the war raging inside him, divine power that demanded retribution and a child's heart that just wanted to be held. "I could kill you," he whispered. "Right now. One thought and you'd be frozen solid, preserved forever in the moment of your worst mistake. I know. I could destroy this entire pack, everyone who watched and did nothing, everyone who turned away from my suffering. I could make them understand what 4 years of cold feels like. You could. Then why—" His voice broke completely. "Why does it hurt so much not to? Why is choosing mercy harder than choosing vengeance?" Elin stepped forward, placing herself beside Kael. She met Torin's eyes over his son's head and saw the same recognition there. This moment would define not just Kael's future, but the shape of his power he carried. "Because mercy requires strength that vengeance never will," she said softly. "Anyone can destroy. It takes true power to choose not to." Kael looked at her, then back at his father still kneeling before him, and made his choice. The blue light in his veins dimmed, not extinguished, never that, but banked like a fire settling into embers. The cold receded slightly, enough that breathing no longer hurt, enough that the ice stopped spreading. "I forgive you," he said, and the words cost him everything. Each syllable was agony, fighting against 4 years of accumulated pain and the divine power that screamed for retribution. Not because you deserve it, not because what you did was acceptable, but because I refuse to let your cruelty define who I become. Torin's face crumpled. He pulled his son into his arms, carefully, reverently, as if touching something infinitely precious that might shatter at rough handling. Kael's small body remained rigid at first, unused to embraces, uncertain how to receive comfort after so long denying. Then, slowly, he softened. His small arms came up and wrapped around his father's neck, and he buried his face against Torin's shoulder and finally, allowed himself to cry. Not the divine tears that froze instantly upon falling, just a child's sobs, messy and human and heartbreaking in their normalcy. "I'm sorry," Torin kept repeating, rocking his son gently. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Elin watched them, tears streaming down her own face, and felt the weight of 4 years lift slightly. Not completely, the scars would never fully heal, and the trauma would always be there. But enough. Enough for breathing room. Enough for hope. Footsteps in the corridor announced more arrivals. Marcus appeared first, then Beta Soren, then others. The council delegation led by Alpha Darius, their faces grave and determined. They stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. The frozen chamber, the father holding his son, the power that still hummed in the air like the breath before a storm. Darius stepped forward, his voice formal, but not unkind. "Alpha Torin, we need to discuss the charges that have been brought against you. The systematic abuse of a minor, specifically your own son. The violations of pack law regarding the treatment of pups. I will answer for all of it." Torin didn't look up, didn't release his son. "Every charge, every crime. And I will face the council's judgment and accept whatever punishment they deem appropriate." "The evidence is substantial," another council member said. "Witness testimonies, medical records, the physical state of the child himself. This could result in removal from the alpha position, exile, or—" "I know." Torin's voice was steady despite his tears. "And I will accept it. But first—" He pulled back slightly to look at Kael. "First, I need my son to know that whatever happens to me, he will be protected. He will be cared for. He will have everything I denied him." Kael looked up at the assembled council, his eyes still glowing faintly blue, but holding a measure of humanity that hadn't been there 3 days ago. "The pack needs to change," he said, his child's voice somehow carrying the authority of something far older, not just my father. And all of them, everyone who watched and did nothing, everyone who valued their comfort over a child's suffering. He stood, separating from his father, and addressed the council directly. "I am Winterborn. I carry power that could reshape this territory, could freeze every wolf here solid if I chose, but I don't want to rule through fear. I don't want to become the monster they created." Darius nodded slowly. "What do you want, Kael?" The boy, the godchild, thought for a moment. Then, "I want the pack to acknowledge what happened. No more secrets, no more looking away. I want every wolf here to understand that they failed, and that failure has consequences." He glanced at Elin, who gave him an encouraging nod. "And I want change, new laws about how pups are treated, real protection, not just words, systems to ensure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." "That can be arranged," Darius said. "The council has the authority to implement such reforms." "And my father," Kael continued, his voice softening slightly. "He should face justice, but not death, not exile to die alone with his guilt. He needs to stay here, to see what he almost destroyed, to spend the rest of his life trying to make amends." Torin's eyes widened. "Kael, you don't have to." "I'm not doing it for you," Kael interrupted. "I'm doing it because killing you or driving you away would be the easy path. Mercy is harder, forgiveness is harder, and I choose the harder path." He turned back to the council. "I am 4 years old and I contain the power of a god. That combination is dangerous and I know it, so I'm asking for help. and teachers who can show me how to control what I am, mentors who can help me grow into this power without losing my humanity, and time to be a child while I still can, before the divine completely overtakes the mortal. The council members exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the maturity in such a young voice. "We will arrange everything," Darius promised. "Teachers, protection, oversight to ensure your safety and the safety of those around you. The Winterborn were legendary for their wisdom as much as their power. We'll help you claim both." Kael nodded, then looked at his father one more time. "I forgive you," he said again, "but I don't forget. What you did will always be part of my story, always be part of who I am. And you will spend every day of your life knowing that you created both the monster you feared and the God who chose mercy." Torin bowed his head. "I will bear that knowledge, gratefully, because it means you're still here, still choosing, still my son." The council began their formal proceedings, documenting testimony, gathering evidence, preparing the charges that would reshape the pack's leadership. But through it all, Kael stood by the window in his frozen chamber, looking out at the territory that had been his prison and would now become something else. Not a home, not yet, maybe not ever, but a place where he could learn to be both God and child, where he could hold divine power in one hand and mortal compassion in the other, where he could forge a new path between vengeance and mercy, between isolation and connection. Aunt Elin came to stand beside him, careful to maintain the distance his power required. "You did it," she said softly. "You chose the harder path. Did I choose right?" He looked up at her with eyes that held both 4 years and eternity. "Will I regret mercy when the rage comes back? Will I wish I had frozen them all when I had the chance?" "Maybe," she admitted. "Probably, on hard days. But you'll also know that you broke the cycle, that you refused to let cruelty breed more cruelty. That takes strength, Kael. Real strength." He was quiet for a moment, then reached out and touched the ice mural on the wall, the silver wolf walking through the blizzard, alone but unbroken. "Tell me the story again," he requested, "about the brave wolf who became strong in the cold." Elin smiled through her tears and began to speak, and her voice weaving of the familiar tale. And as she told her story, Kael listened with a child's wonder, the divine light in his veins dimming to a gentle glow. Outside, winter held the territory in its grip. But it was no longer the punishing cold of trauma and suffering. It was the clean, pure cold of new beginnings, of power claimed and wielded with wisdom, of a God choosing to remain human enough to love. The pack would reckon with their complicity. Torin would seek redemption that might never fully come. The council would establish new protections, new laws, new accountability, and Kael, winter-born prince, godchild, survivor, would grow into his power while learning to hold on to his humanity. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. But this chapter, this terrible, a beautiful chapter of suffering and choice and mercy, had reached its end. And for the first time in 4 years, when dawn broke the next morning, there was no ritual in the courtyard, no ice water, no child being tortured in the name of cleansing, just a father and son learning to know each other, just a pack learning to face their failures, just a godchild learning that power and compassion need not be enemies. Winter had come, but spring perhaps was possible, if they were brave enough to believe in it. 4 years of ice water, 4 years of a child apologizing for existing, 4 years of a pack that chose silence over courage. And in the end, it was the tortured boy, the one they called cursed, the one they watched suffer every single morning, who chose mercy, who chose to be better than the cruelty that shaped him, who chose humanity over vengeance, even when vengeance would have been justified. Because healing from trauma isn't a single moment of forgiveness. It's 1,000 small choices, made every day, to not let the pain define you. It's learning to hold power without becoming the thing that hurt you. It's discovering that mercy can be harder and braver than rage. And Torin? His journey toward redemption will be long and painful and uncertain. Some wounds cut too deep to ever fully heal. Some mistakes can only be survived, not erased. But he will spend every day of his life trying to become the father Kael deserved from the beginning. This is a story about the scars that shape us and the choices that define us, about the difference between being a victim and being a survivor, about the terrible weight of divine power in mortal hands, and the courage it takes to wield that power with compassion. Winter came to that pack. It will never fully leave. But in the cold, something beautiful can grow, if you're brave enough to let it. If this story moved you, if Kael's choice resonated with something in your heart, if you need to know what happens next, subscribe now, and I will see you in my next story.